Howard Blumenthal, and this is another episode of Reinventing School, roughly number 30. I'm beginning to lose count, which is great because we've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of different people about what school looks like as we move further into the 21st century. And today, I'm thrilled that we're going to spend a full hour with Peter Gray, who knows a lot about this stuff, has thought a lot about it, and has really been influential in the way that I've been thinking about school. Because it's a much more playful, much more student-centric view of the world. So, Peter, hello. Give us a sense of where you are, and just because the guest is always better at explaining their background than I am, give us a sense of who you are in the world, and why I care and others do too.
Well, I'm a research psychologist. I'm a research professor at Boston College. For many, many years, I've been interested in children's natural ways of learning, which also means I'm interested in play and curiosity. And so that's I'm a evolutionary oriented psychologist, so I bring that perspective to bear. That the view that I've developed is that children evolved over time. The human species evolved over time to educate themselves as in childhood. Schools are a new invention from an evolutionary perspective. Children have always had to be educated. They've always had to acquire the skills and knowledge and values of the culture that they're growing up in. And until recent times, there was never any idea that it was the obligation of adults to make sure that children learn that stuff. It was always the obligation of children to learn it. And so over time, children acquired the drive and the great joy of learning about the world that they're growing up in. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. You know, what are these natural drives for education? How do they play themselves out when we allow children to make use of those drives instead of put them in coercive schools?
So, when were you a kid?
I was a kid in the Well, I was born in 1944, so I was a little kid in the late 40s. I was most of what we think of kind of as childhood was mostly in the 1950s.
And where were you?
And we moved a lot, which interestingly, I think the fact that we moved a lot, kind of in retrospect, as I think about it, in some ways primed me to be interested in play, because every place that we moved every year or so from one town to another, mostly in the Midwest, although we lived in Duluth, mostly in small towns in the Midwest. So we lived in Duluth during my first, during my middle school, what would now be called middle school, and first couple of years of high school. And then we moved to Vermont when I was 16, and I've been east ever since. But the fact that we moved so much, and of course, in the 1950s, for people who don't know this, children were always outdoors playing. Whenever school wasn't in session, you would find kids outdoors playing. It was easy to meet kids. Whenever we moved, I just went outdoors, and there they were, right?
Oh, right.
And
Well,
and
let me stop you for a sec. You paint this. You said the Midwest. That's a big place. So, give me a sense of: are these small towns everywhere? Are you living in cities?
So I
Roughly
lived
what
so
states?
mostly in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and except for I lived I was born in Texas actually, but that was because my father was stationed there. Um, but as a very little child, I was in Minneapolis. But by the time I was 5, we had moved to a small town called Montgomery. I'm sorry, called Monterey in southern Minnesota. And I lived there for a couple of years, and then we moved to a small town outside of Madison in Wisconsin. And from there, we moved to a couple of other places, but ultimately to a little town called Hill City, town of about 500 people, Hill City, Minnesota, that's near the Canadian line in northern Minnesota.
So all of
Yeah.
these places, when you would go out, you would see kids, even in a place as small as 500 people living in
Oh
Hill
yeah,
City.
there would always be kids outdoors. And, from the age of 5 on, I could go anywhere in town that I wanted, as could other kids without adults. You never saw adults outside, you just saw kids. I mean, there might be adults outside, but they're not out watching the kids. The kids are out playing. And generally in age mixed groups. And the challenge to me, which I think was a kind of special education, is that every place I moved, the kids were into different kinds of play. And so I
Like
had to
what?
learn new
Like what?
skills. In order to become one of the kids, I had to learn new skills wherever we moved.
So
so
what sort of, when you say it's different, what were they doing here versus there?
So, for example, in Sun Prairie, which was like the town's name, it's a flat place, right?
Mhm.
uh, there was a lot of baseball. We played baseball all the time. At that time, this was back in the 1950s, and at that time, the Braves, what was the Boston Braves, had become the Milwaukee Braves.
Mhm.
And when I was 8 and 9 years old, I and all of my friends were sure that we were going to be Major League Baseball players, and we played baseball all the time. Not Little League. It wasn't a game that adults directed. We just went out to the vacant lot, as kids did everywhere in America. Went out to the vacant lot and made up our own games and played baseball endlessly. The other thing we did at that was also the only place that I lived where kids made kites. So people made kites. It was a challenge to build kites that could fly the highest and look the most beautiful. So we made kites, we played baseball. In the winter, we did a lot of ice skating on frozen ponds. That was true in every place I lived. These were all at that time before global warming, the ponds would freeze. And we lived on, we spent a lot of time ice skating. So then when I moved, just to take one other town, in Hill City, when I was where I lived when I was 10 and 11, we moved when I was 12 from there to Duluth. This was on a lake, and we spent all our time on the lake. The town was located on a very long lake. There was a rowboat, an old rowboat on the lake that we kids assumed belonged to the community. It probably actually belonged to somebody, but we pretended it belonged to the community. And we would go out on that boat, taking long trips and fishing. We'd be swimming every day. Fishing was my passion during the summers when we lived in there. I spent as much time as possible fishing, and as did many of my friends. So this was the lake period. So, I could go on and on, but the
Well,
point
what's
is, is that kids, every community had what academicians call a culture of childhood. There would be a whole culture of children that adults had nothing to do with. The children the children had their rules, the children had their structure, the children had their ways of playing, the children had their kind of whole social group that adults were not part of. And in fact, there's good reason to think that this is the normal way that children have grown up throughout most of time. That even when we go back and look at hunter-gatherer cultures, it turns out that children they spend most of their time with other children away from the adults in the community. And they're learning because they're interacting with other children in an age mixed group where they're learning skills. The younger kids are learning skills from older kids as they're playing together.
Now, I'm going to compare notes with you a little bit. So I grew up in Queens, in New York City, in a neighborhood that was surrounded by a few parks, but
Hmm.
it was also a very Jewish neighborhood, surrounded not so long after World War II, surrounded largely by German population. So we couldn't quite leave our block, and because it was dangerous, baseball bat, get hit with a baseball bat, kind of dangerous. And so we were very contained. But There were kids out all the time. This is
Sure.
later than yours. Um, it was always a mixed age range. Parents were involved sometimes, Cub Scouts, that sort of thing, a little bit of organization, a little bit of synagogue stuff, a little bit of church stuff. But for the most part, we simply interacted with other kids whose backgrounds were very similar because this was the new apartments. So people from the Bronx and Brooklyn from older families moved to Queens because it was the air was clean, right? It was just sort of like the new part of New York City. So, yeah, but everything you're describing, from fishing to sledding to everything, it was all our world. And
Right.
our parents encouraged it because it looked a lot like their world on the as poor kids. So we're one generation up in Brooklyn, street games, all of that. So we all knew the same street games because our grandparents had taught us what to do with chalk and a sidewalk and pavement. So it's very similar. Um, and I guess in your mind and in my mind, that's what childhood is supposed to be because we lived through it and it was happy. Yeah, more or less. Now it's different from that. And it's not just different from that here, it's different from that in lots of places in the world. So I was hanging out, I do an interview on site when we can travel with kids in different parts of the world. And I happened to be in a neighborhood in Sao Paulo, and I ask kids, what do you do? And they're like, well, we're really not allowed to go out beyond the gates of our three very large apartment buildings because it's dangerous. So I started thinking about, what does dangerous mean? Does dangerous mean you're going to get hit by a car? Relatively few kids get hit by cars, but that seems to be the biggest problem, um, or truck. Um, but they're legitimately fearful of being abducted, even though there aren't a lot of abductions. And the abductions that happen seem to be related to family issues, not stranger danger. So we've enclosed ourselves. Why? Do you know? Do you have any sense of that? Like, say, it's clearly different now
Right.
than it was. Why is it different now? What happened?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why it's different, but I think they fall into two general categories. One category has to do with the spread of fears in the culture, the spread of fears by the media, the spread of fears by so-called experts who see it as their job to warn parents of every conceivable danger
You're
that's
an
out there.
expert. What do you think?
And well, I'll tell you that in a moment, but let me finish this. So that's one of the basic reasons. So parents hear all these messages. I mean, there was a big shift. The shift really began. I mean, it really began somewhat in the 1970s, but it kind of accelerated in the 1980s to overprotecting children and the fear of their going out. And at that time, you could hear, I still remember public service announcements that went, do you know where your child is right now? You know, and if you don't, you know, the implicit message is if you don't know where your child is, you are a negligent parent. You know, there was this phenomenon, women were starting to work, so moms weren't home. And there was this fear of the latchkey kid being home alone, and then the latchkey kid going out and playing, and there's no moms around to watch them. So there was that cultural change, which I think played some role in it. So, and the other thing around that same time, you know, while you were eating your breakfast cereal, you would have a carton of milk on the table in front of you, and there would be pictures of missing children on that carton of milk. And you would see every morning, you'd see this picture of a missing child, and you say, oh my God, that could be my child. And the implication was that these were children who had been snatched away by abductors, you know, by strangers. And in truth, actually, my understanding is somebody went back, I can't give you the reference to it, but went back and actually did a study to see what actually was the case with those children on the milk cards. And most of them were runaways, actually.
Oh,
And a
really?
few of them who were snatched away by relatives, not by strangers on the street. Truth of the matter is, strangers on the street just aren't generally that interested in your child. It's not strangers on the street. It's a very rare crime. I mean, not to say that it doesn't happen. Anything happens. People get hit by lightning too. But if you were to try to run your life by things that are that statistically improbable, you wouldn't do anything. So so that was one of the categories of reasons. The other category of reason has to do with school. And school has become over time a bigger and bigger deal. We began to, we had we began to fear that America is falling behind academically, that particularly the Asians they are really educating their children and they're going to pull ahead of us. And there began to be international tests that were comparing kids from different countries. And so we developed this view that our children aren't learning enough in school. And so school became gradually over time a much bigger deal than it was before. And we developed a kind of what I call sometimes a schoolish mentality about child development. School suddenly became the overwhelming consideration whenever we thought about children. And so even when they weren't actually in school, we began to want them to be in something like school. So we would put them, instead of just sending them out to play, we would put them in kind of school-like things like adult-directed sports, which is not play. We would have them take karate classes, or we would have them take, depending on what culture you are, Chinese calligraphy, whatever it was. Moreover, school, and in addition, school itself was taking more and more of the day. So the school year, I've actually looked this up, is now 5 weeks longer than it was when I was a kid. The school day is about close to an hour longer on average throughout the country. When you add in homework, and when I was a kid in school, I don't know about when you were a kid, New York City was always ahead of the curve on these. New York City had homework before the rest of the nation had homework. But
Okay.
throughout most of the nation, certainly when I was in elementary school, there was no homework in elementary school. Once in a while, a teacher would ask you to write a poem or a story or something and bring it in, something creative that would be fun to do and share with the rest of the class. But we never carried workbooks back and forth. We never carried books back and forth. When you were home, you were home. You didn't, the school day ended at 3 o'clock or whatever time the school day ended. So kids had much more time than they do today.
All right.
School has taken over children's lives.
So let me stop you for a sec, because what I'm hearing you say, I think, is we've got it wrong. Do we
Yeah,
have
of
it wrong?
course.
Huh?
Absolutely. We have it
We
wrong.
do. We absolutely we have it. Okay. I just wanted to. Yeah. I just sort of a little
Right.
touched on there. So if we have it wrong, and it would be difficult for me to believe that you're the only one who's speaking this way. It would also be difficult for me to believe that instinctively kids, parents, teachers feel differently from the way you do. Like we're all kind of observing the same thing. It doesn't make sense the way we're doing it. It doesn't link together. And if that's so, how do we get out of this situation?
Well, I think to a lot of people it does make sense, and
Why?
because it has occurred gradually. If this change had occurred suddenly, if all of a sudden we went from the childhood that you and I had to the childhood that, if this was suddenly a decree, no longer are we going to let kids out.
Right.
Suddenly we're going to take away five weeks of summer vacation. Suddenly we're going to add all this homework to kids. People would have rebelled. People would have said that's crazy. But it didn't occur that way. It occurred gradually over time. So young parents today did not grow up the way I grew up. They grew up in something, so that at every decade, there's been a change, but it's been a small change. And from year to year, it's a very small change. So creeping changes, people begin to think, oh, this is normal. It's normal. Children, people think it's completely rational. People think that if my child doesn't get all this education, they're never going to make it in the world. So parents are convinced that their children, parents are often even more so than teachers, are the ones who are putting pressure to have more homework. And I hear this from teachers all the time. Not all parents by any means, but many parents are. And so this is So the unfortunate thing is many people do think this is rational.
And is there a way to dissuade them of that silly idea?
Well, that's what I've been trying to do for some time now, and a number of other people are also, with some success. And there are people who are beginning to come around on it. I think that people in recent times are beginning to come around, and the reason is because I think it finally reached the point where so many kids are suffering, obviously suffering. That doesn't mean everybody's suffering, but so many kids are suffering. The rates of anxiety, the rates of depression, even the rate of suicide among school-age children has, first of all, it was a gradual increase over all this time. So people began to think it's normal for teenagers to be depressed and anxious and so on and so forth. But I think more and more people have seen it in their own child to the point where they're beginning to say something has to change here. And so, and there are educators who are beginning to see that too. So um, one of the groups that I'm part of is the organization called Let Grow, which Lenore Skenazy is the president of. And she and I and a couple of other people formed this organization a few years ago. And we are working with schools, we're working with whole communities to reverse some of this, to bring more play into children's lives through schools in many cases, and through communities, trying to change the culture within the community so that play is welcome. Children are welcomed outdoors without adults around. And so at this point, it's still a fairly small number of communities, fairly small number of schools, but it's beginning to happen and it's spreading.
Is there, how do I ask this? If you could start this from scratch, right now, today, as we're recording, I don't think that the new President Biden has named a Secretary of Education, unless that happened in the last hour. So I'm going to use all the power I've got to make you Secretary of Education. And I'm going to ask you, as on behalf of the president, to start from scratch. I think you're right. I think you're on the right track. What do we do first? And by the time we're done with 4 years, I want complete transformation. So you're in charge. How do you approach this? And remember, you've got a fair amount of power and a lot of money and a lot of control over what happens at the state government level. What are you
Yeah,
going to do?
I would dispute the question of whether I would have, no matter how much money I had, no
I
matter
just
what my title was.
I made that possible. Okay, I
So
can
I
do
don't,
that.
so the fact of the matter is it's very hard to change a culture. And so I guess here's what I think that I think the first step should be would be to, and unfortunately, I'm a Biden supporter, but Biden is not the person who is going to appoint the right person. Actually,
That's okay. We're
but the
fantasizing.
yeah, but the first thing I would do, what I would try to do is to increase the educational options that people have. So right now, um, you have to pay your own money if you do anything other than the public school.
Okay.
And so we do have, unlike a lot of other countries, we have a situation where it's legal to homeschool. We have a situation where it's legal to start a Sudbury model school where children are free to direct their own activities. We have all kinds of schools
We have micro
available.
schools, we have charter
We
schools,
have
we have
micro schools,
magnet
we have charter
schools, right?
schools, but none of them get public support. Charter schools get public
Yeah.
support, but they're not very different. So but none of the real alternatives get public support.
Okay.
So of course, everybody's going to send their kids to the school that that you can send your kids free. The school also serves a very important babysitting function in a world where in most families, if there are two parents, both of them work. So that it's important, that's another thing that's happened over
Mhm.
time.
Okay.
Schools become babysitters. So it would be nice if people could make that option without having to worry about how they're going to pay for it.
Okay, so let's
So
say
that
that
providing
public.
public support for
Okay,
alternative modes of education would
let me
be
flip that.
a valuable route.
Let's say you have control over the public schools, and don't think too operationally here. I want to know what you would like to see happen. So you've got 50 million kids or something like that, right? In how many public school? 100,000 public schools, some number like that, right? Um, K through 12. Go in there and say, we're going to make some changes now. We're going to do this differently. What are you going to try?
So, so there's sort of two hats that I have regarding education. One of them is the let grow hat, where we are trying to make some gradual changes within the school system. We're bringing in more play. We're instituting age mixed play for an hour during the day, where all the kids in the school together are playing. We're trying to reduce homework with some success, and so on and so forth. So those are the kinds of changes that I think are practical. I think those changes can be made. The ultimate world that I would look for educationally would be to abolish what we think of as school entirely. That schools came about at a time when there was some value, when it makes sense in some way, given the culture of the time, to have children go to a place where the primary lesson was obedience. The schools were really developed. The schools that we know of today were developed during the time of the Protestant Reformation. And the purpose of schools, the clearly stated purpose of schools, was to drive the willfulness out of children and to teach them obedience. Also to teach them to read at a time when many parents did not read. So you weren't going to learn to read at home. And the primary reason for teaching reading was so they could read the Bible. And even more
Right.
important than reading the Bible was understanding the Bible. So
Let me
schools,
let me stop you for a sec. It's 2020. What do you want to do now?
well, this is what I'm getting to.
Okay.
There's a difference between what I could do now, which I just told you before,
Right.
and what my ultimate belief about schools are.
Right.
I think ultimately schools as we know them, even schools as we knew them when I was in school in the 1950s, which were not as odious as they are today. Schools are are not necessary as we have schools as we have them today are not necessary. And schools, the whole premise of schools works against real education. The premise of schools is that all children, that first of all, that you segregate children by age, which runs against children's nature. Children are designed to learn from other children in age mixed groups. Young children learn by interacting with older children. Secondly, the idea that all children are supposed to learn the same thing at the same time, no matter what their interests are, simply runs counter to everything we know about how children naturally learn. So what we've done, children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves by pursuing their own interests, by playing, by exploring. Children are incredibly curious, but their curiosity is totally shut off in school. And it has to be shut off in school. You can't possibly allow children to pursue their own curiosity in school the way we've designed schools. And that's been true ever since we've had schools. So this is not something new. So I have been studying for many years now children who are not going to school as we know it, but children who are in an environment where they can educate themselves by pursuing their own interests. And instead of imposing a curriculum, we provide the conditions that allow them to pursue their own interests. That's what I would ultimately want. I would want to see settings such as the kinds of settings that we see in agile learning centers, in North Star type schools. There's a whole set of schools called Liberated Learners, Sudbury Model Schools. these have been around long enough that we know they're successful, and kids from all kinds of backgrounds have gone to them and they're fine. And these fit with our democratic attitude. People are not being coerced. People are not being forced to do things that they don't want to do. And we're respecting children as human beings. We're not subverting their human rights. And it turns out they become educated and they go out and if they want to go on to college or higher education, they can do it. They get good jobs, they become well educated. So the idea that we have to send children to this kind of thing that we have come to call school in order for them to do well in our world is simply not true. It's been proven that it's not true. And so ultimately, I would want to do away with schools, and I would want to instead set up the kinds of conditions in which children can direct their own education. My belief is that one way this could happen ultimately would be through the library system. We have already publicly supported institutions for self-directed education. We call them libraries. We give 1/60th amount of money, as much money publicly supported to libraries as we do to schools. If we took just a portion of what we give to schools, libraries could become wonderful.
I've lost your sound. For those who are watching, we had a sound problem. We're picking it up from here. So you were designing, Peter, what a school might look like for 2020 if we had our druthers, right? And you were describing a lot of freedom and far less reliance upon a school structure as we currently do it. So keep going on that track. It's a pretty interesting track.
Yeah, so as I was saying, but it may not have come through, I have for many years been doing research on self-directed education, following children who are not going to school as we know it, but who are being provided with the opportunity to educate themselves uh, by allowing them to pursue their own interests in the same way that children became educated long ago before we had schools. And what I found is that this works. In our culture, children from all kinds of backgrounds have done this. And as long as they're not regarded as dropouts, as long as they're being provided with an educational environment that they can make use of, there are the tools of the culture are available to them. Experts are available to them if they want to use them. They're in an age mixed group of kids who are playing and exploring in the kinds of ways that they're learning from one another. Children become educated and they go on and do well in our culture. So what my ultimate goal would be, it's not going to happen soon, but my ultimate goal would be to see schools replaced, schools as we know them, curriculum-based schools where you impose a curriculum on children and force them through it, whether they want to go through it or not, would be replaced with centers for self-directed education. And I do see some hope. I see a route for that to happen through libraries. Uh, we have in our culture two publicly supported systems for education. We have schools, which are systems for forced education, and we have libraries, which are centers for self-directed education. And currently, we give about 60 times as much public funds to schools as we do to libraries. If we could just support libraries somewhat more, maybe double the amount of funds for libraries, libraries could become wonderful centers for self-directed education. And some of them are already moving in that direction. So libraries these days are not just places that house books. A lot of libraries have maker spaces in them. There are an increasing number of libraries that sponsor free play at the library. There are libraries that have catered specifically to homeschoolers, so homeschool kids can hang out there during the day and play games and pursue their interests. So this is already beginning. So ultimately, what I would like to see is over time, more and more people, more and more families taking their kids out of school, and there now be these other places where kids could spend their time, where they're free to pursue their own interests. They don't have to be at home. They don't, it would solve the babysitting problem. And so that's the direction that I'm looking, that I would ultimately like to see.
How large? I mean, libraries are perceived, as I guess are schools, as part of a community. So if you made a list of community resources, you'd probably talk about the firehouse, you'd probably talk about the local police department, you talk about the library, right? Um, Gas stations, maybe. School is sort of set apart, maybe more fenced in or something, a little more protected environment. But school's also built for lots of people, and it's built for lots of people to hang out all day long. Libraries are built for people to hang out for a couple of hours, and certainly not in the numbers that libraries are. I'm not saying libraries is a bad idea. I think it's a terrific idea, but the space and the facility exists in the school building, not in the library building usually. So do they change places? Like, how do we think about this? And how many people do you want in a building? Do you want just the number of people who typically hang out at a public library, or do you want 100? Do you want 1,000? What's the right, like, what is it? What feels right to you? How many people, multi-generational, or at least multi-age? How many people are, like, paint me a picture.
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, I think that this change is going to occur gradually, and it's not really up to me to decide that. It's up to each person to decide that. So are some kids are going to be very happy with just a few other kids, and they're going to play in the neighborhood, and they're going to pursue their own interests and so on. Some kids are going to want to hang out with many more kids. I think the vision I have is that in each community, the community would see what its needs are, and instead of putting all of the community money into libraries. So most of our local tax money goes to I'm sorry, goes to schools. Most
Yeah.
of our local tax money goes to schools. We'd start putting more money into, maybe it's not always libraries, maybe it's community centers, whatever we want to call them. But I mentioned libraries because we do have a sort of a system of libraries comparable to our system of schools, in a way that no people know what a library is, and libraries are evolving, and they're evolving in this direction. But it doesn't necessarily have to be libraries. So communities would, and I think to some extent, we're seeing this in an incipient way already happening as more and more families are homeschooling. In any given community, now there's a number of homeschooling families, and they're getting together and they're saying, so how can we in our community provide things for our children so that they're not just learning from home, they're involved with other kids, they're involved where there's other adults around, where we can solve the babysitting problem. How are we going to solve that problem? And homeschoolers are solving it in various ways. What I would like to see is, at the point where there's enough homeschoolers so they have some political clout in the community, then we begin to vote some town money to support these families and to support them in the way that the people in that community are asking for support. And maybe it's expansion of the libraries, maybe it's development of a community center, maybe, so that's right now you can homeschool if you can afford to do it. And if you don't have, if one parent can be home, it's hard to homeschool otherwise, although people do it. And it's easier to homeschool if you can afford a lot of resources and travel and so on and so forth. So if we can provide some town money that provides those kinds of resources, it wouldn't be nearly as expensive as our public schools would be. You just don't need that amount of money. I mean, the schools that for self-directed education operate on far less money than our public schools do. So over time, I mean, we would be saving tax money with this kind of system of education. But what I'm trying to say is, I think it's a mistake to think that we can sit top down. What if I'm the czar of education and that I can dictate what the educational system would look like? What I think we need to do is we need to allow families to decide what they want, and By doing that, and over time, I think that the thing will win out. What will win out is more freedom for children. My experience is that when people see that freedom works, people choose freedom. And I think that people are beginning to see that freedom works. And over time, they're going to see that it works, that children do become educated when they're free, if we provide them the resources and opportunity to do so. It becomes hard to rationalize forcing children to learn what they're not interested in, forcing children to spend so much of their day in school where many of them are bored, many of them are anxious, many of them are getting depressed, believing that that's the only way they can become educated, when the fact of the matter is we now know that self-directed education works. We have to provide the conditions that allow more people to do it.
Now, you're a reasonably high profile guy in this, and you've been at this for some time, which means that probably there's a lot of people who are familiar with your ideas. Fair assumption? There are a lot of school districts out there who are sitting there now going, what do we do now? We can't have the kids in school, but we can't have the kids out of school. Not everybody has a Chromebook. And if they do have a Chromebook, they don't have connectivity. But if they have connectivity, they might not have a quiet place to work. And parents are losing their minds. Teachers are really struggling to make this work. And what you're suggesting is we may not want to be working with this set of rules at all. We may want to look at this very differently.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting. I mean, the whole pandemic and the closure of schools and the disruption of schools and the situation where parents don't know from one day or week to the next whether what kind of schooling is going to be available to their kids through the public school has resulted in a large number of families taking their kids out of school. So the removing their kids from school is still, it's still a long ways from the majority. But right now, the number of people who are officially homeschooling is at least double what it was a year ago.
What would, just so
Uh,
we have a sense, that's 2 or 3% up to 6% or something like
it's
that?
well, there was a Gallup poll taken in August of how many families in America were planning to homeschool their kids. And that said, according to that Gallup poll, 10% of families in America were going to be homeschooling their
And that's
kids.
5 up to 10, not 10
And
going up
so
to 20.
that's 5 up to 10.
Okay.
Now, there are different ways of assessing how many, it's a little hard to really quantify the Department of Education, U.S. Department of Education does a survey every 4 years, or at least they used to. I don't know that they're doing it now, but the last survey, there was something like 3.5% were homeschooling. That was about 4 years ago.
Right.
The Gallup poll a year ago, a year before the pandemic, said 5% were homeschooling. And this more recent Gallup poll said 10%. Now, I just read this morning on the Boston Globe that in Massachusetts, the number of kids enrolled in public schools has declined by 4%. So that's at least
Okay. So we're
consistent
still, yeah, yeah, yeah,
with
yeah.
what, and so the people talk about. I'm kind of a believer in the tipping point theory of social change, that social change occurs very gradually at first. Somebody's got this new idea, or somebody has this belief that the society should change in some way, and a few people begin to do it, and it takes a great deal of courage to do it, but you do it. And you suffer some flack for doing it. You get criticized for doing it. But you do it. And if it turns out to be successful, if it turns out to work, a few more people begin to do it, and then a few more people begin to do it, and then at some point, so many people are doing it that everybody knows somebody who's doing it, right? Everybody knows somebody who's doing it, and then suddenly it's no longer so weird.
Hmm.
Suddenly now it's a normal option. It's not a strange thing to do. So different theorists have different numbers. Some say it's when 10% of the population are doing something that it becomes normalized. Some say it's when 15% becomes normalized. But what I'm suggesting is we're getting close with homeschooling to the point where homeschooling is becoming normalized, where people are beginning to see that as a reasonable option. You don't have to justify it. And more homeschoolers are doing what they call unschooling. They're homeschooling, but they're not doing school at home or anything like school at home. They're allowing the kids to pursue their own interests, and they're supporting their kids in pursuing their own interests. So these changes are occurring. Now, I think at some point, at some point, the floodgates will open as more and more people are gradually doing it, and as it becomes easier to do it because
Right.
more people are doing it, then we'll see a change. Now, I don't know when this will occur, but I think that the corona, the pandemic and the disruption of schools is hastening that. I think that some of the people clearly are just homeschooling until the pandemic is over, and then they'll send their kids back to school. But I don't think that's going to be true for all of them by any means. And I'm hearing from more and more families who are saying, you know, I think we're going to stick with homeschooling now that we've tried it. I see my kids are happier than they were in school, and I see they're learning better, and I see it's not so difficult to homeschool as I thought it was. So I think a lot of them are going to stick with it, and I think we're going to see a growth and a continuing growth in homeschooling over time.
Now, the United States is not the only country that has school and students and all of these issues that float around. Surely there are other countries in the world who have said, you know what? Peter's right. We need to install freedom and play and give kids their own heads about what to learn and how to learn it. So I'm hoping you're going to say, "Oh yeah, there's 38 countries that are doing this. Let me list them for you." Are you going to do that?
No, there are no countries doing
Why
it.
not?
There are no countries doing it. And in fact, we're ahead of most other countries on this. We have a tradition in this country of respecting individual freedom, which has allowed, and in fact, part of it is our respect for religious freedom. So the pioneers in homeschooling were those doing it for religious reasons, and we couldn't stop them because we it would violate the religious rights. And then
Right.
once we had people doing it for religious reasons, then people would say, well, I have these other reasons, why should you stop me? You know. And so I think we are, you know, as flawed as we are as a nation in many ways, I think we're ahead of most other nations in terms of this, in terms of allowing alternatives in education to occur. Now, we don't provide financial support for it, but we at least allow it to occur in ways that in most of Europe, this does not. Most of Asia does not.
Are there some countries somewhere, perhaps an island in the middle of the Pacific, that is experimenting with the idea of giving kids freedom to learn?
Not in, I mean, in the same sense that we are, there are countries who are doing it. So in the UK and various other countries, there are no other countries that I know of where homeschooling is as common as it is in the United States.
That's confounding because there's a logic that runs through from you and I learning by playing on the streets in our various neighborhoods and towns and all that, to picking things up along the way and being perpetually curious because we were both trained that way, to somehow ending up in a conversation together and both of us affiliated with fairly substantial universities. We have gone through the system. We are both educated people who grew up with a lot of freedom. So, how do we reconnect this? It can't be that we're the leaders because we're pretty sluggish on this. And if the United States is the best there is, I don't think our grandchildren are going to be out of this loop that you and I both seem to agree isn't a good place to be.
I think our grandchildren might be. I would. They might be, but I'm not. I'm not too sure of that. But I think that I think that the change is already occurring. It is now much more, it's now easier for children to, it's now easier for a family to make the decision to take their child out of school than it has been before, and more families are doing it. It's not, as I said, it's not going to occur all of a sudden, but I think that it is gradually occurring. And I think it's occurring for a number of reasons. One is, the typical, the way the school system has been operating is, the logic is, if the children aren't learning as much as we think they should be learning, then we need to do more of what we're doing instead of thinking.
Okay.
So, that's the logic of, so they keep doing more and more. And what they're doing is they're burning kids out, and more parents are recognizing that their kids are getting burned out. And that's one reason for taking their kids out. As more and more families are doing this, it becomes easier to do it because there's less of a social stigma about doing it, because there, you can point to other people doing it. You can get social support for doing it from your neighbors who are doing it. We are also, the other thing that I haven't said is, we are also in a different time in this technological world. Home education has never been easier. Every kid knows that he or she can learn whatever they want anytime. You don't have to go to a school. You don't have to take a course. You can learn whatever you want. If you want to study anything, you can find the greatest experts online talking about it. All the Harvard courses are online, free for anybody who wants to take them. You don't have to go to an institution. This is new in history. There was a time when, if you wanted access to information, you had to go to where the books were, you had to go to where the experts were. Now it's all coming to you. So if for no other reasons, that's, schools are obsolete. You just don't have to go to a place where to find knowledge, and every kid knows that.
What about teachers?
The irony is that kids are sent to school, and then they're not allowed at school to use their iPhone to look up the stuff they want to look up.
Unbelievable.
They want to educate themselves
So
that way.
teachers are caught, right? Because you, on the one hand, you've got a kid who says, I can learn this on my own. And then you've got a school budget that's saying we're going to have to do some cutting here because the pandemic was a problem. And we've got a teacher who's trying his or her best, more often her, to guide the student, to not necessarily provide the answers, but to encourage the student to find the answers on their own. But we're still very much in a 20th century, maybe even a 19th century model. So, how do teachers think about this? Not only right now, but 5 years, 10 years, 15 years out?
I mean, I think, just as with the rest of the culture, I think a few teachers are beginning to understand it. And we're seeing more and more teachers quitting. And we're seeing more and more teachers quitting
Yeah.
because they feel, and it's partly because they feel that we've gone to such extremes in terms of testing and homework, and they see how stressed the kids are, and they're quitting because they don't want to be part of a system where they're harming children. And teachers also, there was a time when I was in school where teachers had a lot of authority in the classroom. Teachers could decide, and if you had a good teacher who understood the kids, I remember in fifth and sixth grade, we had a teacher the same teacher for both grades, who, first of all, when we were only indoors for 4 hours a day, we spent 2 hours outdoors playing every day, every school day. And even then, so we were never indoors for more than an hour at a time. And even then, she would say, "Oh, I see you're restless. Get up and play." And she had hula hoops and things in the classroom.
Yeah, we had the
So
same.
a teacher,
Yeah.
so a teacher could do that. A teacher can't do that today because they would be fired if they did that. They've got to get those test scores up, and the principal is invested, and the superintendent is invested, the state is invested. The school is gonna close if they don't get the test scores up. And they believe, whether it's true or not, they believe that the more they drill the kids, the more the test scores are going to go up. So the teacher who tries to do that kind of thing, and I've heard this from many, many teachers, even the kindergarten teacher who tries to allow a lot of play, will get fired. So that's the way the school system is going. Now, many of the people going into teaching, the younger people going into teaching, haven't given a lot of thought. You know, they've gone into it. They believe in this system. They went through it. They worked hard, and they think, okay, it's no fun, but it's necessary, and I'm going to do the best job I can as a teacher and make sure that the kids get high test scores. So there's a whole range of what teachers believe, but I think that it's very hard. You know, we are several generations into school where we all have a sense of what school is. Our parents went to school. For most of us, our grandparents went to school. School was less onerous then, but it still was the same model, the same kind of
Mhm.
thing. Generally, unless you were in a small country school, it was age segregated, and you had a curriculum, you had testing, people know what a school is, and so we're used to that. We believe that school is part of growing up, that it's a necessary part of growing up. And it's hard to change that attitude. In addition, the other thing that makes hard change is the school system is a huge bureaucracy with many, many people's salaries depending on it. And so you threaten that bureaucracy, and you threaten teachers unions, and you threaten this whole system. There are textbook industries that make, there's a huge part of the economy is invested in schooling as we know it. There's no financial interest in doing away with schooling. There's a lot of financial interest in keeping schools as they are. So those kinds of pressures are also forces that resist change.
You may have heard typing in the background because I was just curious what the market size is of K through 12 educate. Like how much money is actually made? How big is the marketplace? Um, and it looks like it's about $20 billion, something like that, for K-12, and then add another 10 billion for higher education, just so we have a sense of what that looks like. So you're right, it's a pretty big business. Um, I'd hate to think we're doing this to support a textbook industry, but that's a whole different question. Um, but you're right, it's a big, complicated industry, and that can exert a great deal of pressure. But teachers together can stand up and say this is not what it ought to be. Now, are they feeling the threat of getting fired? I mean, there were 3 or 4 million teachers in the United States. Now is a moment in time when things aren't exactly peachy. So, wouldn't now be the time to say, you know what, everybody, we have another plan. Let's try this because what we're doing isn't working.
Well, I would like to see that. I don't think teachers are going to stand up to do away with school, but they could stand up to do away with some of the testing, to do more recess, and so on and so forth. There are places where teachers have tried to do that, as far as I know, always unsuccessfully. One place that I'm most familiar with is in Brookline, Massachusetts. 2 years ago, essentially all of the kindergarten teachers protested by stating that they believe that what they're being required to do to these little kindergarten children is hurting the children.
No,
They're more and more they're requiring, the schools are requiring the kindergarten has become like first grade, and it's become a very difficult first grade. And there are children who are suffering. They're not ready to learn to read, but they're supposed to be able to read basically by the time. And they're being drilled, and kindergarten teachers are being required to remove the play stuff that used to be in their classroom so that they can be drilling the little kids. The teachers see the kids crying. The teachers see how stressed out the kids are. And so essentially, there are something like 32 kindergarten teachers in the town of Brookline, and something like 28 of them signed a petition, and the others, I was told, didn't sign it just because they were not in town at the time it was signed. They presented this publicly, and it was in the newspapers and everything. Now, they did not take the step of saying we're going to strike, but they presented this petition. We've got to change this. I checked a year later, nothing had changed. So here, all the teachers agreed. They presented the petition to the superintendent of schools. As it turned out, that superintendent resigned, but I don't think it was because of that reason. A new superintendent came in, and the last I checked, there was no change. That's the closest I've seen to a unified presentation on the part of teachers, and it failed. Teachers are not known for
Activism.
unless it's about their own salaries. And unfortunately, this is true for most people.
Yeah, there
That
is that. I mean, this is a heavier lift. I certainly understand that. Well, why don't we do this? I have a couple of other very specific questions, but a mutual contact and stuff. So why don't we roll the credits? And then if you can hang on for about 5 minutes right afterwards, that would be
all
great.
right,
Okay. So Peter, thank you so much. This has been a
sure.
really invigorating conversation, and I agree with just about everything you're saying. So it's always nice to find a kindred spirit. Thank you. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.